Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to KEI, those who are here in-house and those joining us on our YouTube live stream for today's event, Economic Security in U.S. China Competition, The View from North Korea. And today's program is part of our Korea Policy series where authors of articles for KEI's flagship journal, Korea Policy, will present key arguments and takeaways from their paper drafts, which will later be published in our Korea Policy Journal. And today we're very pleased to be joined by Rachel Min-Young Lee, who is a senior analyst at the Vienna-based Open Nuclear Network, or ONN, and also a non-resident fellow with the 38 North program at the Stimson Center, my former home. Rachel was a North Korean collection expert and analyst at the open source enterprise with the U.S. government from the year 2000 to 2019, so nearly 20 years. And I should say, I remember actually, Rachel, it was, I think, like my second or third day when I had joined 38 North, and this is in mid-January 2020, before COVID upended everything. I think it was at the Wilson Center, and you were presenting, I think, a sort of a primer on how to do open source research on North Korea.
The one hosted by Jean Lee.
That's right, yeah. And I remember thinking, there's no lack of very smart people in this town who are very well informed, but it's a real skill, a real art to be able to convey your knowledge in a way that's accessible and that I think that can impress people in the know who are experts, but also be accessible to people who are non-experts. And I remember thinking, as you presented, that you were bridging that gap so well. And I had been familiar with your work before then, and of course with 38 North since, and in other sort of platforms as well. So I'm very pleased to have you here today and to have your contribution to Korea Policy. Before I turn things over to Rachel to present her paper, just briefly on our run of show, Rachel will present, as I said, her paper for 15, 20 minutes or so. And then we will turn to a little bit of a discussion between us, some questions that I've prepared ahead of time, and then we'll open things up to the audience here, but also online. So if you are online, please, if you have questions that you think of as Rachel presents, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will get to them during our Q&A. So that is more than enough out of me, and I will turn to you to present your wonderful paper, a copy of which I have here, and I've been poring over. So please, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Clint, for the very warm introduction. And also thank you to Korea Economic Institute for this opportunity. Very interesting to share my observations with an audience who are in the room and online. So when
we may have an audio snafu. Thank you, Sang.
So when Clint first reached out to me in June to invite me to write a paper on economic security and U.S. China strategic competition and a view from North Korea, my first reaction was, wow, this is very interesting, because when we talk about economic security, we don't often think about North Korea. North Korea is not really in the equation. It's normally, global supply chains, semiconductor, and of course all of the countries associated with those topics. And North Korea doesn't really figure into that discussion, obviously, because it's not connected to the global economy. It has a very minimal role in global supply chains at best. So it has been a great opportunity for me to follow up on and piece together some of the issues that I have been following and examine them from a holistic point of view, and that is how North Korea views economic security and U.S. Sino strategic competition, and how that in turn has figured into its foreign and economic policy thinking. So my presentation today will focus on the political rather than economic fallout of U.S. China relations, for the obvious reason that, again, North Korea's role in the global economy and global supply chains is minimal at best. So briefly, the structure of my presentation will be, it'll be basically four parts. First, North Korea's perception of economic security. Secondly, U.S. China competition and implications for North Korea's foreign policy. The third part will be implications for North Korea's economic policy, and then some observations about what I view as North Korea's China de-risking. And even though this is primarily about U.S. Sino competition and North Korea, Russia will be covered in my presentation because as it is one of the outcomes of North Korea's changing worldview. So to start with North Korea's stance on economic security, though the concept of economic security has always existed in a domestic context, so North Korea is always linking national security to their potential for economic development. And we see this narrative growing stronger when North Korea wants to spend more money on defense. It was never really referred to as economic security. Now, in external contexts, we start to see North Korea mentioning economic security specifically at the end of May 2022, and that was right after a conservative president in South Korea, so Yoon Suk-yeol, took office, and this was also right after his first summit with Biden, where economic security was one of the main agenda items. And so economic security in North Korea is mentioned mainly in two contexts. One is in relation to South Korea, basically expressing wariness over South Korea's pivot to the U.S. On the pretext of economic security, the strengthening and broadening of South Korea, U.S., and Japan relations, and cooperation and its implications for North Korea's security environment. The other context in which North Korea likes to talk about economic security is in relation to China, basically supporting China's position on the various issues connected with its economic security and U.S. Sino competition. It was notable to me that all of the items on China, reports, commentaries supporting China with regard to economic security were posted to the North Korean Foreign Ministry website. So basically, we have the North Korean Foreign Ministry explicitly endorsing China, and that's really within the. It's consistent with North Korea's pivot toward China, which I'll get to in greater detail later. Interestingly, North Korea started commenting on a shifting global economic order around the time that it started to discuss supporting China's position on economic security. And usually this was by way of promoting BRICS. At the same time, again, that it began to track China and economic security issues, which to me indicated that Pyongyang viewed the shifting global economic order in connection with U.S. China strategic competition. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the implications for foreign policy. North Korea's view of the deteriorating China-U.S. relations and how that's figured into Pyongyang's foreign policy thinking. I mentioned briefly a couple of minutes ago that the North Korean Foreign Ministry started supporting China on economic security-related matters in the summer of 2022, and that really is in line with the North Korean Foreign Ministry starting to back China and also Russia at the same time on the broad range of issues, from diplomatic issues to economic security, cyber hacking. And this was not shifted because there wasn't really any support for either China or Russia on the foreign ministry website before August 2021. But the fact that the foreign ministry started to endorse both of those countries so explicitly starting in August 2021 indicated to me that North Korea was really reassessing the global order and its relations with China, the United States, and later Russia. In the back of this foreign policy review was what Pyongyang perceived to be the Biden administration's continued hostile policy. And probably not just the Biden administration, but from Pyongyang's point of view, all succeeding U.S. administrations' continuation of so-called hostile policy. Also, what it viewed as a shifting global order and Washington's continued hostile policy appear to have generated serious skepticism within the North Korean leadership about the country's three-decade policy of non-alignment with China and Russia and normalizing relations with the U.S. Through denuclearization, and basically using Washington as a buffer against its the two great power neighbors. I mentioned what North Korea views as a shifting global order. In the fall of 2021, around the time that the North Korean foreign ministries began to support China and Russia by means of its website, the North Korean leadership seems to have taken what it viewed as a shifting global order seriously, and that began to figure into their policy thinking. And the reason I say this is that the following month, in September 2021, Kim Jong-un, in his speech to the Supreme People's Assembly, and this is the North Korean parliament, for the first time characterized the global order as a new Cold War. I believe KCNA English translated that as neo-Cold War. And in a speech to the SPA the following year, in September 2022, Kim, for the first time, assessed that a US-led unipolar world was transitioning to a multipolar world, and that this transition was being accelerated significantly, quote unquote. And so North Korea has had a tendency to view China and Russia together, forming one anti-US pole in a multipolar or bipolar world. And I think that the developments of February 22, and by developments, I mean the Xi-Putin no limits in friendship joint declaration and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, could have convinced the North Korean leadership that the China-Russia partnership may effectively counterbalance the United States and the West, that US leadership on the global stage was being weakened, and therefore North Korea should realign with China and Russia. I mentioned briefly before that North Korea seems to be moving away from the United States or the policy of normalizing relations with the US through denuclearization. There were two recurring themes in the wake of the collapse of the Hanoi summit. First, the North Korea was in for a long-term confrontation, quote unquote, with the US. And secondly, therefore, North Korea needed to be prepared accordingly. This thinking on Kim Jong-un's part translated into a hardening of policy across all fronts, domestic and foreign. But I think it is important to know that Pyongyang had not quite ruled out denuclearization from its public narrative. And of course, when I say this, some people might question, well, did North Korea ever have the intention of denuclearizing? I want to make it clear here that from its public narrative, that didn't quite go away, despite the hardening of policies across all fronts. But in September 2022, in Kim Jong-un's Supreme People's Assembly speech, he said there was no bargaining over nuclear weapons and that there was no line of retreat. No, he said a line of no retreat had been drawn, excuse me. And this indicated to me that it was a major shift from its three-decade policy of normalizing relations with Washington through denuclearization. And if that was not clear enough, in case that wasn't clear enough to all of us, Kim Jong-un basically reiterated the same point in his Supreme People's Assembly speech in September 2023. So that was only a couple weeks ago, and that was also about 2 weeks after his visit to Russia. And he said, as long as our republic exists as a socialist state, and as long as the tyrannical nuclear weapons of the imperialists trying to stamp out independence and socialism exist on the earth, we must neither change nor concede the present position of our country as a nuclear weapon state, but on the contrary, continue to further strengthen the nuclear force. And this was in reference to his decision, or the party's decision, to codify the nuclear law into the Constitution. And he ended this comment by saying, this is the serious strategic judgment made by our party and government. So I think the notable word here is strategic. He was basically saying that this is not on a whim. We are taking a longer view of what is happening in the region and the world, and this is the decision that we have come to. This is not some knee-jerk reaction to what is happening in the region. And I think that's the meaning of strategic care. So in terms of pivoting to China, I think North Korea's changing calculus vis-a-vis China appears to have shaped or at least provided some impetus to North Korea's decision to move away from its three-decade policy of normalization with the U.S. Through denuclearization. And I think a milestone, a watershed moment in North Korea-China relations in Kim Jong-un's time was in June 2019 when Xi Jinping visited Pyongyang. At the time, North Korean media's coverage was notable for its emphasis on the socialist bond between the two countries. And I say this is notable because the socialist bond would become a recurring theme in North Korea's, at the highest levels of North Korea's public messaging in connection to China, for example, in Kim Jong-un's letters to Xi Jinping. So after Xi Jinping's visit to Pyongyang, we see North Korea taking a clearer stance on what used to be thorny issues that they had refrained from commenting on. So these would be the Hong Kong issue, this would be the Taiwan issue. North Korea started endorsing China on Hong Kong in August 2019, and that was only 2 months after Xi's visit to Pyongyang. The party implicitly endorsing China on Taiwan in June 2020. Again, that was not too long after Xi's visit to Pyongyang. These moves culminated in the North Korean Foreign Ministry website's shift to a pro-China stance in August 2021 that I alluded to earlier, which signaled or seemed to signal a reorientation of Pyongyang's policy toward China. And Russia, which we can't forget about given the circumstances, North Korea's pivot to Russia in August 2021, as I mentioned before, happened at the same time that North Korea began to endorse China, and this is the Foreign Ministry website. So the fact that these two countries were, North Korea started backing, the Foreign Ministry started backing these two countries at the same time, suggested to me that the change in Russia policy occurred as part of Pyongyang's broader foreign policy change. And that is realignment with China and Russia. North Korea's support for Russia became more frequent, and it became quite pronounced after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as evidenced by North Korea's implicit support of Russia's invasion a couple of weeks or even a week after the invasion, and also a few months later, diplomatically giving diplomatic recognition to the two breakaway Ukrainian provinces. And I think it's notable to hear that North Korea's pivot to China has been very steady, whereas its pivot to Russia has been like a sprint. And we started to notice this sprint becoming more pronounced after Choi Sun-hee became the foreign minister in June 2022. I'm not sure if that's a coincidence. It's hard to believe that it is, but I think it's worth noting in terms of timing. And so speaking of Choi Sun-hee becoming a foreign minister in June 2022, Kim Jong-un's letter to Putin in June 2022, for the first time mentioned in connection with Russia strategic and tactical cooperation. And that was a formulation that North Korea had reserved for China. So basically elevating Russia's DPRK-Russia relations to the level of DPRK-China relations. Implications for economic policy. I want to start out with what North Korea might view as the China opportunity. So there were signs as early as spring 2019, shortly after the Hanoi summit, that North Korea was moving toward greater centralization of the economy. And that trend became clearer as months went by. I think we started to see signs of that at the end of 2019 with the party plenary meeting. I think the signs became clearer during the 8th Party Congress. With respect to the economic policy and that trend toward greater centralization. It is important to note that North Korea has not yet rolled back on reform. And by reform, I mean not Western-style capitalism, but North Korea's version of reform. So adopting some elements of capitalist practices, but not full-scale adoption of capitalism. So again, North Korea has not altogether rolled back on economic reform, but North Korean media since early 2022 have de-emphasized Kim's hallmark economic initiatives on the agricultural side and on the industrial side. And I want to emphasize since early 2022 because it should be noted that in early 2022, we saw a key milestone in Kim Jong-un's or North Korea's U.S. Policy. That was when, in January 2022, that was when North Korea hinted at lifting the moratorium on longer-range missile and nuclear testing. And 2 months later, they started to launch ICBMs again. So North Korea's downplaying of economic reform measures since early 2022, when North Korea's foreign policy marked a turning point, further underscored for me the correlation between North Korea's foreign policy and economic policy. And it also suggested that North Korea's weakened appetite to reform the economy was due, at least in part, to the extra space created by deteriorating U.S.-China relations, and also North Korea's improving ties with China. So the immediate and obvious gains from the space offered by Beijing are, again, obvious. China's vetoes of additional UN Security Council sanctions after North Korea resumed ICBM testing. China also repeatedly failing to enforce and in some respects even hampering the monitoring of North Korean international sanctions since 2018. I think those are the obvious gains. I think the more important and interesting questions that we should keep in mind, however, are Pyongyang's intentions toward economic development and its ultimate goal, whether its ultimate goal is to pick up on and breathe life into its slowed down economic reform at some point, and how it intends to create a favorable external environment for doing that. So, though with less frequency and lower levels, North Korea continues to refer to reform, and this is despite the apparent reversal in U.S. policy. And for a long time, North Korea, and this is one of the reasons that I think North Korea wanted to improve ties with the U.S., was because of its intention to improve the economy. And so the thinking on Pyongyang's part was that it needs to improve relations with the U.S. for that favorable external environment, for North Korea to be able to proceed with its economic reform. Now, if it has reversed that policy of improving relations, normalizing relations, improving relations, at least for the time being with the U.S., then how do they intend to improve that environment? And I think North Korea sees an opportunity in China. North Korea has had a number of ventures with China. I think the one that comes to mind, for example, is one of the key ones that comes to mind is the Siniju Special Administrative Region project. That and some other projects have failed. But despite the failures, North Korea seems to be going back to China for investment. Between 2013 and 2019 or so, North Korea created more than a dozen special economic zones around the country. And I have to think that North Korea had China in mind mostly. Who knows, maybe towards the end of 2017, when it was preparing to improve relations with the U.S., in 2018, 2019, perhaps it had sanctions lifting in mind and maybe investment from other countries. But I do have to think that China was the primary target for its economic development zones, the special economic zones. And there were reports, in fact, earlier in the year, I think in spring around April, that that North Korea actually sought out Chinese investment in the inter-Korean economic project, the Kaesong Industrial Complex. And this was citing the Unification Ministry in South Korea. So I talked about what Pyongyang might view as the China opportunity. I think for Pyongyang, for North Korea, China is a double-edged sword, right? It provides opportunities, but at the same time, there's that wariness, there's that fear that they're overly dependent on Beijing. I mean, that has always been there historically, and historically they've always tried to minimize China's influence on North Korea. And I think we continue to see that. So what I want to talk about now briefly is Pyongyang's internal struggle to reduce dependence on China. Although Kim Jong-un's emphasis on self-reliance in his policy statement in April 2019, and this was in the wake of the Hanoi summit, that was largely understood to be a reaction to the failed summit in Hanoi. But I also think that the self-reliance theme was used by the North Korean leadership to reduce dependence on China. And so during its 3+ year of national lockdown to prevent a COVID outbreak, it broke out in the end, but during the lockdown, North Korea waged a massive national campaign on recycling and reduction of quote unquote dependence on imports. And these are the exact words, dependence on imports. These were not new themes, recycling, dependence on imports, reducing dependence, but they had never waged this level of campaign before. And it was during the COVID, during the lockdown. And I have to think that this, campaign about reducing dependence on imports was targeted at Pyongyang's top trading partner, China, given that China accounts for 90% of North Korea's trade. So I think for me, it would be reasonable to conclude that the Kim regime used the self-isolation period to maximize, perhaps even test domestic resilience and minimize dependence on China. And I suppose you could say, well, didn't they wage that campaign because economic conditions were deteriorating with the lockdown? I think that's one way of looking at it, but I think we should also think about why the regime kept its doors closed for so long. I mean, did they really have to keep the doors closed for 3.5 years? Was it just because of the quarantine? And because of the various signs in the media, I think domestic resilience, strengthening domestic resilience, really was one of the reasons. And the other reason being that they wanted to regain and reassert central control over all aspects of society, including the economy. North Korea's self-reliance campaign climaxed at the year-end party plenum in 2022 when North Korea condemned the dependence on the technology of others. And this stigma of depending on the technology of others essentially reversed Kim's previous position that introducing foreign technology was acceptable. And this party plenum was followed by a spate of North Korean media articles warning against assistance from the outside. Again, when we think about North Korea bashing assistance from the outside, we tend to think about the U.S. and the Western powers, but I also think that it targets China. So I think this is a nice segue into North Korea's de-risking from China. Kim and his associates likely, in my point of view, do not view Beijing as a completely trustable partner in its fight against the U.S., which of course is important because it has been a recurring theme in North Korea's messaging toward Beijing, including Kim Jong-un's letters to Xi, the socialist bond, the common cause, the fight against Western powers or Western-led global order, jointly responding to the regional situation, the global situation. I think from North Korea's point of view, China is trying to manage rather than escalate tensions with the U.S. So Beijing trying to manage its relations with Washington. The fact that Beijing wants to be viewed as a responsible global power. Neither one of these may be to Kim Jong-un's liking, because what Kim Jong-un is looking for is a reliable partner in this anti-U.S. struggle on the global stage. And so for that reason, I think he finds Putin to be the more attractive partner at the moment. And I think we see this in Kim Jong-un's letters, in Kim Jong-un's letter, actually, to Xi Jinping, and North Korean media's characterizations of Kim's meetings with Shoigu and Putin. Ever since the Army Day celebrations, Armistice Day celebrations at the end of July, we see a cooling down of North Korea's messaging toward Beijing. They ceased using expressions like joint response or common cause. We no longer see strategic and tactical cooperation in North Korea's media messaging toward China. Instead, those formulations have moved to North Korea's messaging toward Russia. So jointly responding to the international situation, for example, strategic and tactical cooperation, we see that in Russia instead. So without seeing the country names in the reports, it's kind of hard to see. You would be surprised to know that those were actually geared at Russia and not China. I think in terms of why this sudden cooling down, was it just because China sent a lower level delegation to the Armistice Day celebrations compared to Russia, which sent the defense minister, who's obviously much higher ranking than the head of the Chinese delegation, or were the signs already there? I think for me, it was interesting that North Korea even invited such a high-level Russian to an event that traditionally has been a very much China-oriented event, the Armistice Day. The Russians didn't really have a role in that. North Korea has always used that event to pay tribute to the fallen soldiers of China's People's Volunteer Army. Russia was never really in the picture with regard to this event. So why the appearance of such a high-level Russian official? So perhaps we started to see a signal from Pyongyang that maybe it had made a bigger policy shift, one that involves pivoting more closely to Russia. North Korea likes to group China and Russia in the same pool as I mentioned earlier, but that's really for convenience. But, as we can see, I think North Korea is already kind of, it has that history of pitting China against Russia during the Cold War. And I wonder if we are starting to see the same thing now, although the circumstances obviously are very different from the one that the world found itself in during the Cold War. Now, I would just like to wrap up by way of concluding the summary of my paper. So, U.S. China strategic competition has offered unique opportunities to North Korea. The immediate benefits, again, are sanctions. China blocking additional UN sanctions and helping North Korea evade international sanctions. More significant, however, is that China, or the deteriorating relations between the U.S. and China, seem to have offered that extra wriggle room or space to North Korea to look for alternative foreign policy and economic paths. For example, on the foreign policy front, shifting away from normalization of relations with the U.S. through denuclearization and realigning with Russia and China, both of which are, again, major shifts from what we saw in the 1990s. And on the economic front, North Korea slowing down on economic reform, again, if it sees China as providing an opportunity that the U.S. is not going to provide. Was that a factor in Pyongyang's thinking about economic reform? And again, despite the opportunities that China offers North Korea, of course, North Korea is wary of the overdependence, its economic overdependence on China, and we have seen signs of that during the lockdown, and we see, just the fact that Kim Jong-un went to Russia, that he chose Russia as the first destination of his foreign travel after he reopened borders, I think is very significant. That we had the Russian defense minister showing up at the Armistice Day celebrations, I think was another strong signal that North Korea, for some reason, is pivoting more closely to Russia. So what does that mean then? Is Russia part of a tactical, short-term tactical solution? Or does Pyongyang see Russia as a longer-term strategic, a key player in its longer-term strategic thinking? I think it remains to be seen. I think I was looking at the Chinese and Russian reactions to what is unfolding right now in the Middle East, and I put myself in Kim Jong-un's shoes. And I think that he would like Russians' reaction better. So Russia basically blaming the U.S. for its failed Middle East policy, basically gloating over, the failure, what it calls a failure of U.S. policy in the Middle East. And then Putin, of course, last week at the Valdai Club gave a speech where he said he wants to build a new global order. And I think both of those things are music to Kim Jong-un's ears. And I think in some ways, his comments might reinforce Pyongyang's thinking that, for the moment at least, that Russia may be the more reliable partner in its anti-U.S., on the anti-U.S. front. Thank you. And I'll finish here, and I'd be happy to discuss more.
All right. Thank you very much, Rachel. I have questions I prepared, and then actually other ones that have been rising as you've presented. And I want to make sure I get to the audience as well. But I'm going to do moderator's privilege first. You mentioned, of course, that there's this what appears to be a fundamental shift away from the several decades-long effort to normalize under the guise or some degree of denuclearization with the U.S., right? And for the U.S. to be a sort of a buffer of sorts to Russia and China, with whom there's no love or trust lost, right? And this would provide the favorable external environment for economic reform. But that has shifted post-Hanoi, especially. In theory, what do you think the U.S. government, whether it would or wouldn't do it, could do to shift North Korea's calculus?
Well, theoretically, and I don't know how this would be done, I think is to somehow make Pyongyang see that aligning with China and Russia is not a good idea, and it's better to align with the U.S. In terms of how we can do that, I'm not so sure. In my opinion, with what Kim Jong-un has been saying about denuclearization, realistically speaking, I don't think the next time North Korea shows up at the negotiating table, I don't think denuclearization is going to be on the table, unfortunately. As much as we would like for it to be, I'm not sure that that is going to be on the table, realistically. With Kim Jong-un's comments, I think he's shooting for maybe arms control, maybe some other, maybe not arms control, but some other maybe related measures, but not really denuclearization. That's the sense that I think we're getting from reading the media. Sanctions, lifting sanctions, I don't think that's going to be good enough anymore. The other question that we have to think about at this juncture, since we're talking about once we start thinking about what we might do to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table and what is going to be a realistic option going forward with North Korea. Does North Korea want regime security? I mean, because when we talk about normalizing, North Korea wanting to normalize relations with the U.S., North Korea doing this or that to get U.S. attention, we talk about that a lot. When North Korea fires a missile, we tend to link that to Pyongyang's wish to get Washington's attention. So all of that is kind of, the whole discussion about North Korea's intentions do tend to revolve around their desire to get regime security from the U.S. But is that the right premise? As we start thinking about the different policy paths and options, I'm not so sure anymore.
Is that the right premise for us to have about what's driving
what
North
Korea?
Yes.
If so, as ridiculous as this may sound, from North Korea's point of view, it is an irreversible nuclear power. That's how it calls itself. So if it's an irreversible nuclear power, then does it really need regime security?
It's achieved it, essentially.
I think North Korea knows that it's weak on the conventional side.
Sure.
And I think, they'll try to, make up for it, however, they can. But again, this may not sound very logical, but, looking at it from their point of view, I'm trying to think about how they're looking at things. Is that really what they want? And maybe that's part of the reason why they feel like they don't really need to normalize relations with the U.S. and certainly not through denuclearization. I'm sure they would love to improve relations with the U.S., but not at the expense of giving up their nuclear weapons. And so then why? And then this is when we have to think about what is driving them and why they've decided to shift away.
I'll change tack and actually open up to the audience and ask if anybody has any questions in the audience, both here but also online. Yes, my colleague Tom Ramage. Tom is KEI's newly, not so newly anymore, hired economic analyst.
Yes. Hi, Tom Ramage. Thank you for speaking today. I enjoyed reading in your paper essentially some quotes from the Journal of Kim Jong-un University Economic Journal.
The Kim Il-sung University, yeah.
Yeah, Kim Il-sung, yes. Basically saying that they cannot ignore reliance on foreign technology or imports of foreign technology to North Korea. And then in Article 19 of North Korea's constitution, it calls for an independent national economy. So in any way, is this at odds with North Korea's Juche ideology to have foreign technology, and is China helping them in any way to have foreign technology, such as this drone that was touted at the armistice celebration?
I am not an expert on drones or North Korean military technology, so I'm probably not best positioned to answer that. But going back to your question about the possible discrepancy between their Juche ideology and also the recognition on North Korea's part that it can't not rely on foreign technology. I think Juche is always there in the background, right? But they're also very good about justifying their actions if they need to. So in the past, not in the past, in the past, when Kim Jong-un first came to power in 2012, one of the first things that he said was, we should adopt foreign elements if they serve our needs. That's what he said. So is that going against Juche? I mean, I think that they would say no. So they always have that way of justifying. As long as it serves our needs and as long as we're doing it right, then it's fine. But I think it's notable that at the party plenary meeting recently, they shifted away from that.
Scott.
Scott Snyder, Council on Foreign Relations. You provided a lot of background to the developments of 22 and 23 and reaching out to Russia, but I want to ask you to go back a little bit further and analyze the relationship between the failure of the Hanoi Summit and its reverberations for North Korean foreign policy and the shift in global order, and specifically the frontal breakthrough policy and whether or not that was informed by perceptions of a shifting global order. By December of 2020, we could see evidence that Russia and China were not so cooperative at the UNSC. Or is it really more that the shifting global order provided an opportunity or an accelerant to a pre-existing policy direction that North Korea had already defined?
It's kind of tricky to see what caused, like whether A caused B or whether B caused A. I think for sure North Korea's view of the U.S. was, I think, greatly affected by the Hanoi summit. And the policy, I think, did start to shift a little bit, and I think the long-term confrontation, the recurring theme related to long-term confrontation that we started to see in the wake of the Hanoi summit is a testament to that, because it reflects North Korea's thinking that no matter what it does, this problem between the DPRK and the U.S. will not really be solved easily or anytime soon. So, as North Korea's thinking about the U.S. Started to change, not fully reversing, not full reversal, but as it started to change, I think it started to notice these trends on the global stage, deteriorating relations between the U.S. and China, and then, Russia and China moving closer, which resulted in the no limits in friendship treaty. Of course, whether it's really no limits, it's hard to say. And then the war in Ukraine and China's position to that on that. I think, again, I think it's hard to say what impacted what. In some ways, one might even say, well, maybe it's because North Korea's U.S. policy shifted so much or, did the full reversal that, in order to fill that gap, North Korea then felt the need to realign itself with China and Russia because it needs to fill that void with something. But given the timeline, though, again, I think the shift in the U.S. in Pyongyang's U.S. policy did start to take place after Hanoi, after the Hanoi summit. But the fact that we didn't really see the full scale reversal of policy until, I would say, January 2022, when they basically went back on their moratorium. We did see in the middle, so after Hanoi and then January 2022, in that, between those two timestamps, North Korea really pivoting toward Russia and China. So one could even say that all of those things happened sort of kind of fed into each other in a way.
I just want to pick up on that, the phrase that something had to fill that void. And so we see what I was going to say what you call, but what North Korea itself calls, a shift for a long-term confrontation, right? When it comes to the U.S. And looking, realigning, not just because of U.S. policy, but because of the geopolitical trends toward China and now sprinting more towards Russia. But one of the questions we discussed is, and I want to build on this, how might North Korea respond to a weakened China in the course of U.S. China competition? We see a lot of, obviously, economic headwinds in China right now. And just yesterday, the story again about Evergrande and the other property company whose name escapes me. But also China's own efforts to put a floor under its relations with the U.S., to be a responsible power and stakeholder in its own way, that could place limits on how far it goes in supporting North Korea. But also looking at Russia's situation, we don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to play out. We don't know what Putin's standing will look like in 6 months or a year. It could be a situation where, while North Korea has geared up for long-term competition with the U.S., the two powers that it's looked to help fill that void or gap aren't readily doing so for whatever reasons. I hate to ask you to predict North Korea's behavior, but if it's in this situation where it's not willing to shift back to, with the U.S., but it's two patrons that it would have fill that void aren't doing so in a way that meets its needs, how do you think this will alter its calculus and potentially its behavior? I've asked you to predict their thinking and behavior.
So that's an interesting question, because back in the 1990s, when North Korea made the decision to move away from Russia and China,
Right,
they
this is
had
the shock of the 1992, normalization.
between the
South
Russia
Korea
and South Korea, China and South Korea, right?
Yeah.
It had the U.S., right, to fall back on. But if North Korea really has indeed fundamentally moved away from the U.S., and that has yet to be confirmed, right? I think it's moved away from it, but
what has
the North Korea, the normalization, the policy
Is-
of normalizing relations with the U.S. Through denuclearization. I think it has been reversed, but it could, I guess, change that policy at some point. But supposing that that's a fundamental shift and they have no a desire to go back on that, what other option does it have? And perhaps this is your question. I think after it achieves most, if not all, I'm not sure if it's going to be possible to achieve all, but once that 5-year defense development plan comes to an end, and it should come to an end in 2026, right? Because it was proclaimed in 2021 of January. It will probably be more open to seeking diplomatic contact with the U.S., but just on very different terms, not through denuclearization. So I don't think that they're ever going to go back on that.
That the U.S. may not be willing to grant it, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to tease out the different logics. These are scenarios there, but Andy, do we have any questions online?
We do. So one of our audience from from the virtual audience asks, given recent developments, how does North Korea view economic incentives for engagement with South Korea and the United States, and if projects like Kaesong are still useful?
I think any economic incentives that might come from the U.S. and South Korea, North Korea is not interested in. I mean, the fact that they managed to stay afloat during the 3.5 years of national lockdown, they have their means clearly, and that's a different topic, right? Different discussion for another day. But they've constantly said no to South Korea's offers for assistance, international assistance. They've said no to all of those. I don't think they're interested, at least not at the moment. And certainly inter-Korean economic cooperation projects, no. And certainly not while President Yoon is in office.
Do we have any other questions in the audience? Time for maybe one more. Scott's going to double dip. No, please.
2 questions, but because you focus so much on North Korea's expectations for strategic cooperation between Kim and Putin, it raises a very interesting question of whether or not China's capacity, to the extent that it had capacity, to induce restraint on the part of North Korea has been diminished. And so I'm curious to know how you see the China-North Korea relationship, and in particular, the question of whether or not China has had any possible influence on inducing restraint as related to a 7th nuclear test. Could that be damaged by the apparent focus of Kim Jong-un on Putin and Russia?
I think where how Kim Jong-un's thinking on Russia would have an impact on DPRK-China relations. I don't think North Korea is going to risk damaging relations with Beijing. I think it still wants to keep China somewhere around. I don't think it's going to want to burn bridges. After all, China's the one that always is going to have their back economically and financially. It's never been Russia. And they do need China's money and help, I think. And it's always better, I think, to have 2 supporters on the UNSC than 1, right? That's extra cover. I've always wondered how much, and this is not even relating to North Korea's pivot toward Russia and what we're seeing with Kim and Putin and the summit recently. I think the more fundamental question for me is how much influence Beijing really has over Pyongyang at the end of the day. And this is a question that comes up from time to time. And a lot of people ask, did China have a role in maybe restraining or delaying North Korea's 7th nuclear test? Does China even care about a North Korean nuclear test? At this point, it's a 7th. And I think you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. I think China does have some level of influence on North Korea, but I think for the more fundamental issues, for issues that North Korea really cares about and intends to carry out anyway, I tend to think that Beijing's influence is not as great as we may think it is.
There's a book titled Massive Entanglement, Marginal Influence about the U.S.-South Korea relationship that comes to mind for this. I think they'd be concerned more about not the test itself, but the response it would elicit from the trilateral relationship and Washington. Well, I say this every time, there's always so much more to discuss. The hour is the sweet spot to maintain attention, but not enough to sort of mine all the questions that your wonderful paper and presentation brings to mind. I do want to just reiterate that Rachel's paper will be in our journal Korea Policy, issue 3 of it, which will come out before the end of the calendar year, but also highlight that volume 1, issue 2 will be released any day now, both digitally and in print version. which does contain an article by none other than Scott Snyder himself, and myself as well. And that covers different perspectives on the Indo-Pacific concept and different Indo-Pacific strategies. And next week, this is on our website, and we hope to have it live streamed. KEI our road show at UT Austin will be presenting a panel on, again, the concept of economic security, which is a theme of this particular issue, and looking at the issue of economic security from the South Korean, Japan, China, and U.S. perspectives. And there'll be 2 panels looking at that issue. So stay tuned for that. It's on our website. And thank you again, Rachel, for coming to present your work.
Thank you so much.